Welcome to the Historical Romance Sampler Podcast. I'm your host, Katherine Grant, and each week I introduce you to another amazing historical romance author. My guest reads a little sample of their work, and then we move into a free-ranging interview. If you like these episodes, don't forget to subscribe to the Historical Romance Sampler wherever you listen to podcasts, and follow us on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. Now, let's get into this week's episode.
I am super excited to be joined today by Kat Sterling. Kat writes historical romance featuring rebellious heroines and the swoon-worthy heroes who challenge and support them. From the American South, she currently lives with her brilliant husband in Ireland. When she's not writing, she enjoys nature walks, playing video games, and drinks with friends. Kat, I'm really excited. Thanks for joining.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, so what are you reading for us today?
I'll be reading an excerpt from Winnie West Has an Agenda. This is the first book in my series, The Seattle Suffrage Society. So just to give you a little context of what's going on, this is set in the American West in Seattle, Washington, in the year 1908. So I'm going to be reading a part from chapter 5. So we've kind of already met the main characters, Winnie West and Mac Donnelly. So in this scene, some of the suffragists are already doing petitions and they're gathered in a square when they have a little kerfuffle with some little boys who throw mud. Winnie and her friend duck behind an automobile, and unfortunately, that automobile gets damaged. And guess who might own that automobile? So here's that scene.
All right.
What in God's name happened to my automobile? A man shouted from farther down the sidewalk, and their heads swiveled as one. Even from a distance, Winnie recognized Mac Donnelly's lanky form pressing through the crowd. Satan's handbasket. She ducked behind the bumper once more and lowered the brim of her hat. When her friend stared at her in bewilderment, she hissed, "Hide! I don't want to speak with him." "I'm afraid it's too late for that." Rhoda peered down the sidewalk with interest. "Dare I ask who he is?" Clem asked. "My editor." "Why are you hiding from him?" "And not very well, I might add." "He never has a pleasant word to say," she groaned, "and he's forever staring into space like he's some great thinker, minus the great thoughts, mind you. Honestly, I have no idea how he became an editor." The truth was, his rejection still stung, but she wasn't ready to admit that to the girls, and she certainly couldn't tell them that she'd been obsessing over the dimple that had finally revealed itself in his right cheek. It was much easier to focus on his faults. "I can hear you, Bobcat." Winnie gaped at her friends in horror, but they were no help, their eyes glued to the man on the sidewalk before them. She eased herself to her feet with as much composure as she could muster, but the effect was lost when his gaze dropped to her soiled front, down to her dirtied hands, and back to the damaged windshield. "It's not what you think." She crossed her arms over her chest and stepped into his path. Based on her few interactions with Mr. Donnelly, she didn't have much hope he would be reasonable. If that meant she had to go toe-to-toe with him, so be it. "We were conducting a petition when—" "This is a suffrage event? So what, you throw dirt at innocent men's cars in the name of equality?" His scowl was strong enough to bleach her mud stain, yet Winnie found herself leaning forward in challenge. He was so close she could see the dilated pupils and his deep blue eyes, and every cell in her body fluttered awake. What was it about this man that simultaneously made her want to strangle him and crush her mouth to his? She was both horrified and captivated by the direction of her thoughts. Kiss the enemy? Had she gone delusional from lack of water? Rhoda snorted behind her, diverting Mr. Donnelly's intense gaze and giving Winnie a moment to compose herself. As if anyone related to the McIntyre family could claim to be innocent. Mac's cheeks flushed with indignation, and Winnie's curiosity rocketed. How did they know each other? "Miss Carlyle, isn't it? My regards to your father." Rhoda gave a mocking bow, and in the awkward silence that followed, Mac's attention returned to his automobile. "Wait, it's not just mud. My windshield is cracked." His thunderous expression should have repelled her, but she found herself wanting to place a calming hand to his cheek, as if her touch would magically fix everything. Seriously, what was wrong with her? We were harassed by some young boys, Winnie said, wrangling her absurd thoughts under control. They're the ones who threw the dirt. He spread his arms wide and turned in a full circle. And where are these mysterious boys now? Winnie's nostrils flared, the few remaining vestiges of attraction vanishing in an instant. No man called her a liar. Are you suggesting I'm inventing a tale? All I know is that you're the only one covered in mud and standing beside my damaged automobile, if the shoe fits. It might shock you to know that the Seattle Suffrage Society has loftier goals than damaging your automobile, sir. They ran away after they dirtied Winnie, Olive said. The squeak in her shy friend's voice heightened her anger, but what more could be said? It was clear Mac had already made up his mind, and as she had learned countless times throughout her life, a woman's word always came second. At 8 years old, when Tommy Whitaker let her take the punishment for spilling ink all over the classroom floor. At 16, when she witnessed a robbery, but the male thief convinced everyone she was a liar. At 21, mere months into her marriage, when her late husband decided she should stop working despite her wishes. It was just another item on a long list of insults. She wouldn't waste another breath. Jaw clenched so tight it hurt, she whipped open her handbag and rummaged inside for her coin purse. Thrusting as many coins as she could into Mac's hand, she said, "Here, I'll pay for the boy's damage to your windshield." He gave the money in his hand a cursory glance and shook his head. "This is something that can be resolved with your husband. I won't take your pin money." Her face grew hot and her chest tightened to a painful degree. That was all the money she had until the next payday, and he dismissed it like it was nothing. Maybe it was nothing, but she would be damned before she let him humiliate her in front of her friends. "There is no pin money. I manage my own accounts," she said between gritted teeth. "And my husband's been dead for 2 years, so good luck getting any money out of him." If the silence had been awkward before, now it was excruciating. Mac's mouth opened and closed, but nothing came out. Her friends moved closer in silent support, giving her the strength to raise her chin and meet Mac's gaze head-on. The movement shook him from his reverie, and he said solemnly, "Mrs. West, my words were unconscionable." "Agreed," Rhoda said icily. "Instead of throwing accusations, I should have asked after your well-being. A refined woman like yourself deserves such a courtesy, and I fell short." His throat bobbed, but he didn't break eye contact. "And since you've never given me reason to doubt your word, I've done you a grave disservice by accusing you of a malicious act. Please accept my apology." The flames of Winnie's outrage reduced to glowing embers, able to be rekindled if necessary, yet soothed by Mac's sincerity. How had he known exactly what would get through to her? Part of her suspected it was a ploy to save face, but another part wanted to crow in triumph. At last, a man had admitted to his unfair treatment. Then his gloved fingers were wrapping around hers, enclosing the coins in her palm. She sucked in a breath as the gentle touch sent an electric pulse of desire between her thighs. She almost laughed at her body's lack of judgment, but it meant nothing. Anger and lust were merely two sides of the same coin. "I won't take your money," he said softly. "Fine by me." She pulled her hand free and dropped the coins back into her change purse. The task returned her senses, and she looked up with renewed boldness. "I accept your apology, Mr. Donnelly, which could only be made sweeter by a generous donation to our cause." "You can send it to Longfellow House," Clem chimed in helpfully. Something like admiration flicked across his face. "You'll receive my donation in the next few days, Miss—" Winnie quickly performed the introductions, and though Rhoda's greeting included an ill-concealed glare, his apology had seemingly worked on them as well. "And will you allow me to sign your petition?" Mac asked. Winnie couldn't contain her surprise. "You support our cause?" "If all suffragists are as earnest and resolved as you are, I would be a fool to stand against it." Olive let out a low, dreamy sigh, and Winnie fought to maintain a serene expression as she removed the petition from the basket. Once it was signed, Mac handed it back to her, his finger grazing hers as the pen exchanged hands. For the second time in a span of moments, a spark of awareness shot through her. Was she so desperate for affection that the smallest touch could affect her so? Or was it because Max stared at her with an intent expression, as if she were the only woman in the square? Rhoda came to her rescue once more, saying, "You've earned the pleasure of living another day, Mr. Donnelly." A wry grin tugged at his lips, finally revealing an adorable dimple. "I'm pleased to hear it, Miss Carlyle. Now, ladies, if you'll excuse me, I see my friend has arrived. He'll help me sort out this mess." He replaced his hat, and then, in a softer tone that made her neck prickle, he said, "Mrs. West, I'll see you at the office." She had to clear her throat twice before she could speak. "Yes, you will. I'll have a very interesting list of ideas to show you." "I'm sure you will, but as you already know, it takes a lot to impress me." Winnie waited for him to walk toward a burly, dark-haired man before expelling a long sigh. Bracing herself, she gave her friends an embarrassed smile. "He's terribly handsome," Olive said. "Is he?" Rhoda snorted. "You're blushing, dear." "Over that ogre? Never." Her friends grinned. "We shouldn't tease you," Clem said. "Thank you. But you were eyeing him like a piece of cake to be devoured," Rhoda added. Olive nodded, giggling. "Doubtful?" Her ears heated again, and her mind turned to what Rhoda had said earlier. "What did you mean about Mr. Donnelly's family not being able to claim a title of innocence?" Rhoda shrugged. "I've only heard snippets at parties. Our families run in the same set, and people love to gossip. I've heard a thing or two about his uncle being in the pocket of some questionable politicians." "But have you heard anything about Mr. Donnelly?" Rhoda pursed her lips in thought. "No, nothing about him." The relief she felt surprised her. It shouldn't matter to her if he was the owner of a gambling den, so long as he approved her ideas. And yet, she was happy to know that at least his reputation was solid. "Thanks. Now, I think it's time for that cake. A real cake," she pointed a finger at her mischievous friend, "not a man cake." "Well, shoot, now I want a man cake," Rhoda teased. Clem laughed. "Come on, ladies, it's starting to drizzle, and Winnie has already suffered enough." As they made their way out of the busy plaza, the first raindrops trickling down, Winnie made a vow. If Mac Donnelly was willing to sign their petition, that meant he was on the cusp of supporting her ideas. She was about to become the most annoying fly in the office.
Oh, wow. What a great ending to that.
She's like rubbing her hands.
Yeah. I love a woman who resolves to be more annoying.
Yes.
That was a fantastic scene. I have lots of questions, but first we're going to take a quick break for our sponsors. Do you love to find historical romance book deals? Or are you an author who would like to boost a new release or discount to readers who love historical romance? Historical Romance Book Deals was made for you. Historical Romance Book Deals is a daily newsletter that showcases free books, discounts, and new releases. It's great for readers to find new books and for authors to spread the word about their books. Authors, while HRBD grows their list, you can submit your books for free. Simply visit historicalromancebookdeals.com and use the coupon code HRBDFree. Hey, audiobook listeners! Have you checked out the official Historical Romance Sampler Season 1 playlist on Libro.fm? On the playlist, you'll find historical romances you heard here first that are available to listen to on Libro.fm. Plus, if you're not yet a Libro.fm subscriber, use code HISTORICAL to get extra credits in your first month. Head on over to the Historical Romance Sampler Linktree to learn more. All right, well, I am back with Kat Sterling, who just read a sample from Winnie West Has an Agenda. And my first question for you is what about the era of the turn of the 20th century, American West, specifically Seattle, drew you to write though in that setting?
I know it's super random at first glance, right? It's definitely not the typical setting for historical romance right now. Not to say there's not, other great American romances, but it all comes down to the theme. So I knew that I wanted to write about suffrage. I loved Evie Dunmore's books, and it was the era of social justice, and I thought, well, what interests me? And it was women's rights, and I thought I want to do suffrage, and I want to do American suffrage. So it was really just a search of what setting and time most excited me. And I decided that national suffrage, which was passed in, 1920, was a bit too late. I didn't really want to write that far ahead. And so I was like, okay, well, what was going on in the 1800s? What was with, state suffrage? And that's how I learned that only 4 states had passed suffrage by, I think, 1896. And then an era called the doldrums started, where there was 14 years that passed and no suffrage was passed in any state in the United States. But things were kicking up on the West Coast. And when Washington state passed suffrage in 1910, it was kind of a domino effect for a lot of the next states. So I was like, well, that's a really cool premise, like kickstarting the movement again, having a victory. And then the more I looked at Seattle, I was like, this history is fascinating. I mean, it was the city was exploding at that point, just so much movement. I think between 1900 and 1910, the population grew. I think I wrote this down, 194%, just Seattle.
Wow.
So when I started reading about it, and I'd visited Seattle many times because my sister lived there for a decade, I just knew that it was the right place. I got excited about it and I thought there's so many stories here that haven't been told in a historical romance setting, and I'm gonna do it. So yeah, that's
Yeah.
kinda how I ended up in Seattle.
That's amazing. And something that stands out to me whenever we're encountering the suffrage movement, and it came out in the scene too where she said kiss the enemy, is that like the suffragists were very aware of how marriage was an institution that oppressed them. So I think that must be a really interesting tension to play with. How do you think about that as you're crafting your romances?
Yeah, I mean, I think that especially came out in Winnie's story because she is a widow and she was in a marriage where she was not supported in terms of wanting to be a professional, wanting to further her education. So now that she is widow, she's reclaiming her life and she's not looking for any man who at all, really, and especially any man who doesn't support her newfound freedom. So there's definitely a tug and pull of that throughout this book, that kind of how do I live for me while still embracing that I deserve love and I can find happiness in this new place. So, yeah, it's a very interesting concept because I also don't really want to write misogynistic heroes. It's just not my cup of tea. I don't mind if they make, the occasional foot and mouth kind of statement, but I didn't want to convert anybody. I wanted there to be reasons for what they were doing, but overall for them to support a woman's right to vote, no matter their background, no matter their circumstance. So
Yeah.
all of my heroes will have that kind of attitude in this series. Yeah.
Have you found examples of men in the historical record who supported the right to vote?
Yeah, yes. So, for example, with the Seattle movement, there were plenty of examples of men going to speak for women in like kind of male-led areas, like different labor groups or in government, etc. So there are a lot of accounts of men working beside women. And actually, in my book, in Winnie West, she goes to a suffrage kind of conference, if you will, out in the countryside. And I do make sure to show that there were men attending these talks as well, that they were interested in supporting the women as well.
I like that. I mean, so often we get pushback when we write heroines who are too liberal minded, but I also sometimes feel in myself giving pushback, but also I think seeing pushback of like, well, men wouldn't be thinking that way because why would they be? So it's nice to kind of know that it's not just wishful thinking that these heroes existed.
No, not at all. And I do try to base a lot, if not all of the stories I write in real history. Obviously we can push the boundaries a little bit or color within the lines kind of thing. But I've done such a deep dive into what went on at that time, and I have so many examples of things that really happened, either in Washington or in a different state. And then from there, it's easy to concoct a fictional scene or setting.
Yeah. So do you tend to do your research before you start doing most of your writing, or is it kind of integrated throughout your process?
I think I do an initial deep dive of whatever's interesting me at that moment because I am heavily influenced by what I find. And I find amazing gems all the time. So, just as another example, my Christmas novella, Snowed In with the Scoundrel, it's based on a Seattle female photographer from 1909. And when I found that, I was like, oh my gosh, like I want to write her story. And my other novella, His by Opening Day, is set around the kind of World's Fair in Seattle. And again, that was based on so many of the things that actually happened at the World's Fair. And so when I find these things in history, they just shout to me, like, this is your story, include this. And so I love that. But at the same time, it can be a double-edged sword because I'm like, but I haven't found the perfect detail. And then, 4 days later, I'm still reading through research. So I'm trying to get better at saying it's okay for you to invent something. This is fiction.
Right. One of the things that strikes me specifically about how much you weave in real things that happened, it reminds me of books I read before I got to the historical romance genre. When I was a young reader, I was reading like Anne Rinaldi and also like the Royal Diaries and the Dear America series. And those were fictional. Well, the Royal Diaries were real people, but for the most part, those books were all like fictional people interacting with actual history that happened, and it was
Yeah.
partly to educate the young readers. So I'm always curious, like, do you also have influences from outside the historical romance genre?
Does the American Dolls series count?
Yes. I was actually working on a theory the other day. I was like, I wonder for like our generation, how much of us started, our love started with the American Girl dolls.
Oh yeah, I loved those. And I felt like they really took me around the world. And they were really good for introducing you to the immigrant experience and branching out from, the world that you lived in. So honestly, probably most of my influences are children's literature or young adult. I think so many of those definitive books like Lois Lowry, a lot of like World War II. Just I remember reading those over and over. Anne of Green Gables, just
Mm.
things that I think were so formative at that time. I think that's where my love of historical fiction began. And then, I got to middle school and was like, hey, what are these other books in the library that look historical but have embracing people on the cover? That opened a different pathway. But yeah, I think that's where it began.
Yeah. Was there one that you identified with the most?
I think I was always a Samantha girl. I just wanted the classic. I think when I was a kid, there were only like four
Hmm.
at the beginning. I think after they started expanding and growing, but at the
Yeah.
time I was like, well, I look the most like her, so obviously
Yeah.
that's me.
Yeah, the original four were Felicity, Kirsten, Samantha, and Molly. But Samantha also doesn't surprise me because then you ended up writing in the same time period that
Huh?
Samantha lives in.
Yeah,
So
that's
maybe it
true.
was
Yeah,
predetermined.
I think so. Yeah. And determined a little bit by Anne of Green Gables. I think it's kind of the same time.
Yeah.
Different side of the continent, but yeah, puff sleeves are still kind of a thing. So,
Yeah, exactly. You'll write in the puff sleeves era. Well, speaking of Gilbert, in the description of Winnie West, he's a hero who's mesmerized by the heroine. And that honestly, like my first thought was like Gilbert Blythe. So, so tell me about, I guess, what gets you going when writing a hero?
sure. I think I always love an intelligent hero. I think probably because my husband's a professor, I'm like, ooh, smart man, yeah. But also like intelligence is relative, and I fully acknowledge that and will embrace that in different characters, right? It doesn't have to just be book smarts. I also really like a male lead who takes care of someone. It could be a family member, it could be, hopefully the heroine as well, but I think that ability to show love, even if they're not ready to say it, is something that I crave when I'm reading or when I'm writing a story. And going back to that idea of like Mac being mesmerized by Winnie, I think I want all of the men just to be totally knocked off their socks by these women. These are rebellious ladies. They're a little ahead of their time. They're pushing buttons. They're trying to go to school. They're getting jobs. They're changing clothing. They're voting in marching in the streets, all of these things. And I don't want a guy that says, "Oh, look here, little lady, maybe you shouldn't be doing that." I want them to say, "Wow, look at her. Like, that's amazing." And I just want them to be impressed. Maybe they don't know why they're impressed. Maybe it terrifies them or they, actively fight against it. But I would not be surprised if most of my male characters end up falling first, just because I love that trope so much.
Yeah, I love that. Well, and the other thing from this scene that stood out to me was how great of an apology this he delivered. And like I had an emotional release as he was delivering that apology to Winnie. And there's this trope of the grovel in the historical romance, which I think usually comes towards the end of the book. But do you have, I don't know that I have a specific question around this, but so I'm going to give you a very formalist question and you can take it however you want. But how do you think about apologies slash groveling in your
Yeah,
books?
good question. I mean, with regards to Mac, he's caught between a rock and a hard place. He's working at his uncle's newspaper. He's waiting to inherit. His uncle says, "I'll give it to you if you do XYZ," which is kind of how he and Winnie get set up against each other, right? He thinks he needs to do this. So he puts his foot in his mouth several times in this story, some more egregious than others. And he always realizes what he's done or he tries to make up for it. And obviously there is a bigger grovel towards the end. And I think just they need to be authentic. I think they need to come from a real place. Like in this part that I read, Winnie's not sure if it's to save face or not, but it feels authentic. And I think that's what I want to see in a grovel. It's not just pretty words. I mean, those are always great. We want to hear the pretty words, but we also want to see it backed up by action, by what comes next. So, yeah, I guess I just want that evidence that you really mean it. Like what do you do next?
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I think it's time to play our game, Love It
Okay.
or Leave It. All right. Do you love it or leave it? Protagonists meet in the first 10% of the story.
Love it. Some of mine meet on like page one. I mean, I'll wait patiently if it's not the first 10%, but in general, love it.
Love it or leave it, dual point of view narration.
Love it. I want to know what's going on in both of their heads for sure.
Love it or leave it, third person past tense.
Love it, but I don't. Are we comparing it to another one? Because I think depending on the story and the genre, I'm okay with any type of style, really. I think we're just so accustomed to third person past in the historical romance that my first instinct is to say, of course, that's the way it's done, but it doesn't have to be, right? As long as it's well written and I can get into that character's head, I don't really mind what style it's written in.
All right. Love it or leave it, third act, breakup, or dark moment.
Ooh, that's a hard one. I do love them. I mean, obviously, I want there to be a reason for it, and there needs to be a grovel or a way back. But I've read some that don't really have a strong breakup. It can be a soft breakup, if you will, or someone thinks they're going to break up. And again, depending on the how light or how angsty the story is, I think both can work really well. So, can I say both? I like both. I love both.
Sure.
Okay.
All right. Love it or leave it, always end with an epilogue.
Love it. Yeah. I think yeah, I want one more glimpse of the characters, whether it's 1 week later, 1 year later, 10 years later. A second epilogue, I could leave it. In fact, I've only written one of those, and I think that shows how I'm like, yeah, it's okay. Also, because I think when I finish writing a story, I'm ready to move to the next character. It's harder for me to keep with those characters much longer, but I appreciate other authors who do. I wish I could, but no, I'll leave it.
Okay. Love it or leave it. Always share research in your author's note.
Yes, love it. I love reading them. I love writing them. In fact, I have to remind myself that it's not a list of works cited and that not everyone cares about that 1,000 articles I read as much as I do. So I try to keep it to, the three most interesting factoids or something like that, or that I think are the most important for a reader to understand, especially if it's something that readers might think is too modern or maybe didn't happen. If I know that I based it on something real, I want that to be evident. For example, the photographer who does some nude photos, a reader might think, Psh, they weren't doing nude photos. Like, well, I can direct you to the website. That sounds sketchier than it is. It's a very tasteful on the University of Washington website.
No, I'm pretty sure as soon as we have any medium, someone's making nude versions.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, so I love the author's note. Love it.
Yeah. All right. And are there any romance rules I didn't ask about that you like to break?
I was trying to think of an example and I couldn't really think of any. So maybe not. Do you have any that you could refer to?
Oh gosh. So in The Sailor Without a Sweetheart, I decided not to have any penetrative sex.
Hmm,
There's sex, but they never have penetrative sex because of her chronic illness. And
right,
so that kind of is sort of breaking a rule. I
right.
wasn't sure how would readers respond to that.
Yeah,
So that's the type of thing that I kind of like to be like, well, what happens if we take that away?
right. Okay, that happens in one of my novellas as well. So yes. But I think I could actually think bigger picture for a second. It's not technically breaking rules, but some readers might see it that way. I mean, just the mere fact that I'm writing stories after 1900 is already like, oh, no, no, that's not historical romance anymore. And it's like, it is, it's over 100 years ago. And also that I'm writing in the United States, that it's not New York in the United States. Like, I think those, the setting and time are technically breaking some rules,
Yeah.
better or worse.
Yeah, there's certainly stepping readers outside of what they're accustomed to.
Yes, exactly.
This has been awesome. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your time with us.
Of course, thank you so much for having me. This was really fun. Thank you so much.
Yeah, where can readers find you and your books?
I am wide, so I'm on all platforms. I'm on Amazon, Kobo, Apple, Barnes& and Noble, Google, all the things. You can follow me on Instagram, Facebook, BookBub, all the places as well. And my website is catsterlingbooks.com.
All right, I will put a link to your website in the show notes. So, listeners, you can just go click through on that. This has been fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you.
That's it for this week. Don't forget to subscribe to the Historical Romance Sampler wherever you listen, and follow us on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. Until next week, happy reading!